Lucy had always enjoyed the quiet of working late. As a junior architect at a prestigious firm, she often found herself staying after hours to finish projects. The office, located on the 24th floor of a sleek, modern skyscraper, was usually buzzing with activity during the day. But at night, it transformed into a labyrinth of silent hallways and dimly lit rooms. It was a Friday night, and everyone else had left to enjoy their weekend. Lucy, however, had a tight deadline to meet. She sat at her desk, the soft glow of her computer screen illuminating the meticulously drawn plans on her desk. Outside, the city lights twinkled like distant stars, but inside, the office was eerily still. Around midnight, Lucy decided to take a break. She leaned back in her chair, stretching her arms over her head, and glanced around the office. The rows of empty cubicles and the faint hum of the air conditioning were the only signs of life. She rubbed her tired eyes, contemplating a quick walk to the break room for a cup of coffee. As she stood up, she heard it, a faint sound, like the soft scuffling of feet on carpet. She froze, straining to listen. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving only the low hum of the building's systems. Shaking off the unease, Lucy grabbed her mug and headed toward the break room. The hallway lights flickered as she walked, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. She reached the break room and filled her mug, the smell of fresh coffee doing little to calm her nerves. As she stood there, the sound returned, louder this time, a distinct shuffle, like someone dragging their feet across the carpeted floor. It was coming from down the hall near the conference rooms. Lucy hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she was alone. She had been the last to leave the office, and she had locked the door behind her. So who, or what, was making that sound? Clutching her mug, she cautiously walked toward the sound. The hallway stretched before her, its shadows seeming to deepen as she moved forward. The shuffling grew louder, more insistent, until it seemed to echo all around her. She reached the end of the hall and turned the corner, her breath catching in her throat. The large conference room was ahead, its glass doors slightly ajar. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of the city lights filtering through the windows. The shuffling sound had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. Lucy swallowed hard and pushed the door open, stepping inside. The room was empty, just as she had expected. The long table, surrounded by chairs, stood in the center of the room, untouched. She felt a wave of relief, but it was short-lived. As she turned to leave, she noticed something odd. A chair at the far end of the table was slightly pulled out, as if someone had been sitting there recently. Her pulse quickened as she walked over to the chair. It was then that she noticed something even more unsettling. A single sheet of paper lying on the table in front of the chair. She reached out with trembling hands and picked up the paper. It was a floor plan of the building, her building, but something was wrong. The layout was familiar, but there was an additional floor, a floor that didn't exist. The floor plan showed a 25th floor, labeled Restricted Access. Confusion and fear mingled in her mind. She knew the building only had 24 floors. She had been working there for years, and she had never heard of a 25th floor. As she stared at the floor plan, the room around her seemed to darken. The lights flickered again, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw a shadowy figure standing in the corner of the room. She blinked, and it was gone. A cold sweat broke out on her forehead as she turned and hurried out of the conference room, clutching the floor plan in her hand. She needed answers, but more than that, she needed to get out of the building. Back at her desk, she frantically searched the company's internal files for any mention of a 25th floor. Her fingers trembled as she typed, each keystroke echoing in the empty office. But no matter how hard she searched, there was nothing. No records, no blueprints, nothing to suggest that the 25th floor existed. Her computer screen flickered, and then a new document appeared on her screen. The title read, Restricted Access, Floor 25. Lucy's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't opened this file, yet here it was. She hesitated, then clicked on it. The screen filled with text and images, but what she saw made her blood run cold. The document detailed the history of the building, but it wasn't the history she knew. It spoke of a tragedy that had occurred years ago during the construction of the skyscraper. Workers had been trapped during a structural collapse on the 25th floor, a floor that had been sealed off and erased from all official records to cover up the incident. According to the document, the spirits of those trapped workers never left. They were said to haunt the 25th floor, existing in a liminal space between the physical world and the afterlife, and anyone who discovered the truth would be drawn to the 25th floor, never to be seen again. As she read, Lucy felt a chill creep up her spine. The air around her grew colder, and she realized with a start that the office lights had dimmed almost to darkness. Her computer screen was the only source of light, casting an eerie glow over her face. Suddenly, the sound of the elevator dinging echoed through the silent office. Lucy's head snapped up, her blood turning to ice. She hadn't called the elevator, and no one else was in the building. The document's words echoed in her mind. Anyone who discovers the truth. She bolted from her desk, racing to the elevator bay. The doors were open, revealing the empty car. She stared at it, dread pooling in her stomach. The elevator should have taken her to the ground floor, but the panel showed it was headed up, past the 24th floor. The doors closed, trapping her inside. Panic surged through her as she pressed the button for the ground floor, but the elevator ignored her command. It ascended slowly, the numbers on the panel ticking up one by one. 23, 24, and then, impossibly, 25. The doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing a dark, decaying hallway that stretched into the abyss. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of rot filled her nostrils. The floor was unfinished, with exposed beams and wires hanging from the ceiling. Faint whispers echoed in the darkness, growing louder as she stepped out of the elevator. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, and as she walked, she noticed strange markings on the walls, symbols she didn't recognize, etched in what looked like dried blood. The whispers grew into low, mournful wails, and she could feel eyes watching her from the shadows. At the end of the hallway, she found a large door marked "Restricted Access." Her hands shook as she reached for the handle, but before she could touch it, the door creaked open on its own. Inside was a vast, open space, filled with the faint glow of dying light bulbs. In the center of the room stood a group of figures, their faces obscured by shadow. They were the workers from the collapsed floor, their bodies twisted and broken, their eyes hollow and lifeless. They stood in a circle, surrounding something that Lucy couldn't see. As she stepped closer, the figures turned their heads toward her in unison, their eyes locking onto hers. She wanted to run, but her legs refused to move. A low, guttural voice whispered her name, and the figures began to close in, their twisted limbs dragging across the floor. Lucy screamed as they reached for her, their cold, clammy hands closing around her wrists and ankles. The whispers grew louder, drowning out her cries. She struggled, but it was no use. The figures pulled her toward the center of the room, where a gaping hole in the floor awaited. She could feel the cold wind rushing up from the depths of the abyss as they dragged her closer. The last thing she saw before she was pulled into the darkness was the faces of the workers, their hollow eyes filled with sorrow and rage. The elevator was found on the 24th floor the next morning, its doors open, but Lucy was nowhere to be found. Her desk was as she had left it, the strange floor plan still on her screen. The building was searched, but there was no sign of a 25th floor. Lucy became just another name on a long list of unsolved mysteries surrounding the skyscraper, and the whispers of the workers who never left their final resting place continued to echo through the darkened halls, waiting for the next soul to uncover the truth and join them on the 25th floor. Mike had been working the night shift as a security guard at the old Riverside storage facility for 6 months. It wasn't the most exciting job, but it was steady work. The facility was vast, filled with endless rows of storage units, most of which were rarely accessed. The place had a reputation among the staff for being creepy, but Mike brushed it off as superstition. His shift began at 10 p.m. and ended at 6 a.m. The routine was simple: walk the perimeter, check the units, and monitor the cameras from the small security office near the entrance. The job was usually uneventful, and Mike preferred it that way. He enjoyed the quiet and the solitude. But one night, as the clock neared midnight, something felt off. Mike was patrolling the far end of the facility, an area he rarely visited, when he noticed one of the storage unit doors was slightly ajar. That wasn't unusual. Sometimes the old locks would give way, but protocol required him to investigate. He approached the unit cautiously, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. As he got closer, he noticed something strange. The door wasn't just ajar, it had been forced open. The lock was twisted and broken, hanging uselessly from the latch. Mike's heart began to race. He'd never encountered a break-in before. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open with his flashlight, illuminating the inside of the unit. It was mostly empty, save for a few old boxes stacked against the back wall. But something caught his eye, a set of muddy footprints leading from the door into the unit. The prints stopped abruptly at the back wall where the boxes were stacked. Mike's pulse quickened. There was no way someone could have gotten in and out without him noticing. He backed out of the unit, his mind racing. He needed to report this, but as he turned to head back to the office, he heard something that made his blood run cold. Footsteps. They were soft at first, like someone trying to move quietly, but they were definitely there. They were coming from the other end of the corridor, echoing off the metal walls. Mike froze, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The footsteps were getting closer. He scanned the area with his light but saw nothing. The darkness seemed to close in around him, the air thick with tension. The footsteps continued, steady and deliberate, until they were almost upon him. Mike could feel his heart pounding in his chest as he backed away, his mind screaming at him to run. But before he could move, the footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening, the kind that made your ears ring. Mike held his breath, listening intently, but there was nothing, just the sound of his own rapid breathing. Summoning his courage, he called out, "Who's there?" His voice echoed through the empty corridor, but there was no response. The storage units loomed on either side, dark and silent, like they were holding their breath. Mike decided he needed to get back to the security office, where he could lock the door and call the police. He turned and started walking quickly, his footsteps loud and clumsy in the quiet. But as he did, he heard something that made his stomach drop. Footsteps behind him, matching his pace. He quickened his steps, and the footsteps behind him did the same. He broke into a run, the sound of the pursuing footsteps growing louder, more frantic. Mike sprinted down the narrow corridor, his flashlight bobbing wildly, casting erratic shadows on the walls. He didn't dare look back. He could feel the presence behind him, could hear the raspy breathing of his pursuer. Panic gripped him as he rounded the corner, the security office finally in sight. He could see the dim glow of the monitors through the small window, a beacon of safety in the darkness. Mike reached the door and practically threw himself inside, slamming it shut behind him. He locked it with shaking hands and backed away, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The footsteps stopped outside the door, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, a soft, deliberate knock on the door. Mike's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the door, willing it to stay shut. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a low, menacing voice. "I know you're in there, Mike." The sound of his name sent a wave of terror through him. He didn't recognize the voice, but the way it spoke his name, like they were old friends, chilled him to the bone. Mike backed away from the door, his eyes darting to the monitors. He flipped through the camera feeds, searching for any sign of his pursuer. But the screens showed only empty corridors, just as they always did. The voice came again, this time from the small window beside the door. "You can't hide forever, Mike." He turned toward the window, his flashlight shaking in his hand. But there was nothing there, just the inky blackness of the night outside. He couldn't see anyone, but he could feel their presence, lurking just out of sight. Desperation took hold. Mike grabbed the phone on the desk and dialed 911, his hands trembling so badly he could barely press the buttons. The line rang once, twice, and then silence. The phone went dead in his hand. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead as he looked around the room, searching for anything he could use to defend himself. But the room was bare, save for the desk and the monitors. He was trapped, alone, with no way to call for help. The voice outside the door grew more insistent. "Come out, Mike. I just want to talk." Mike's mind raced. Who was this person? How did they know his name? And why were they doing this? The door handle rattled, and Mike jumped back, his heart pounding in his ears. He had to get out. He couldn't stay trapped in that tiny room. He glanced at the small ventilation shaft in the corner of the room. It was barely large enough for a person to squeeze through, but it was his only option. He hurried over, prying off the cover and crawling inside. The metal was cold and unforgiving against his skin as he wriggled through the narrow space. Behind him, he heard the door to the security office crash open, followed by heavy footsteps. Mike moved as quickly as he could, the walls of the shaft pressing in on him from all sides. He could hear the person behind him, cursing under their breath as they searched the room. He knew he didn't have much time. Finally, he reached the end of the shaft, where it opened into a maintenance corridor. He pushed the grate open and tumbled out, scrambling to his feet. The corridor was dimly lit, and he had no idea where it led, but he had to keep moving. He ran down the corridor, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The footsteps behind him grew fainter as he put distance between himself and the security office. But he knew he wasn't safe yet, not by a long shot. As he rounded a corner, he saw a door leading outside. Freedom. Mike bolted for it, throwing the door open and stumbling out into the cool night air. He didn't stop running until he reached the road, where he flagged down a passing car. The driver, a concerned-looking man in his 40s, rolled down the window. "You okay, buddy?" Mike shook his head, trying to catch his breath. "Call the police, please." The man nodded, pulling out his phone and dialing 911. As Mike stood there, trembling and exhausted, he glanced back at the warehouse. The building loomed in the darkness, silent and still. But in one of the windows, he saw a figure watching him, silhouetted against the dim light inside. Mike turned away, forcing himself not to look back again. He knew that whoever, or whatever, had been stalking him that night was still in there, waiting. And he knew that he would never set foot in that warehouse again. Emma had always enjoyed the quiet of the night shift. As a data analyst for a small tech company, she often found herself alone in the office, working late into the evening. The silence allowed her to focus, and the empty building had a calming effect on her. But one night, everything changed. It was a Friday, and most of the staff had left early to start their weekend. Emma stayed behind to finish a project due on Monday. By 9 p.m., she was the only person left on the entire floor. The only sounds were the hum of her computer and the distant buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. As the hours ticked by, Emma became increasingly aware of the isolation. The office, usually bustling with activity, now felt unnervingly still. She brushed off the unease, attributing it to her overactive imagination. Around midnight, she decided to take a break. Stretching her legs, she wandered down the dimly lit hallway to the break room. As she passed the row of empty cubicles, she felt a sudden chill, as if a draft had blown through. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and she quickened her pace. Reaching the break room, Emma poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down at the small table. The room was silent, save for the ticking of the wall clock. She took a sip of her coffee, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread. Just as she was about to return to her desk, she heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping sound. It seemed to be coming from down the hall, near the entrance to the office. Emma froze, her heart pounding. She listened intently, hoping it was just the wind outside. But the tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. It had a pattern, almost like someone tapping their fingers on a desk. She tried to dismiss it as a trick of her tired mind, but curiosity got the better of her. Emma stood up and slowly made her way down the hallway. The tapping grew louder with each step, echoing in the empty office. As she neared the source, she realized it was coming from the reception area, just beyond the double glass doors that separated her workspace from the main lobby. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the door handle. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open and stepped into the lobby. The tapping stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. Emma scanned the room, but it was empty. She walked over to the reception desk, her footsteps echoing on the polished floor. The desk was immaculate, with nothing out of place. There was no sign of anything that could have caused the noise. Feeling uneasy, she turned to leave when she noticed something strange. The elevator at the far end of the lobby was open, the light inside flickering. She hadn't heard the elevator arrive, and there was no reason for it to be on this floor, especially at this hour. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she approached the elevator. The doors remained open, and as she peered inside, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A single bloody handprint smeared on the wall inside the elevator. She stumbled back, her heart racing. Panic set in as she realized she was completely alone in the building. Grabbing her phone, she dialed security, but the line was dead. In a state of terror, she ran back to her desk, determined to grab her things and leave. But when she reached her desk, she found her computer screen filled with cryptic messages, flashing one after another. "Get out. Leave now. Not alone." The words scrolled across the screen, mocking her. Emma's hands trembled as she shut down the computer and grabbed her bag. She ran for the exit, her pulse pounding in her ears. As she reached the glass doors leading to the stairwell, she caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of her eye. She turned, and there, standing in the shadows near the break room, was a figure. It was tall, its face obscured by darkness, but she could feel its eyes on her, cold and malevolent. The tapping started again, louder this time, reverberating through the office. Emma didn't wait to see what it was. She threw open the door and bolted down the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the empty stairwell. She didn't stop running until she was outside, gulping in the cold night air. When she finally reached her car, she looked back at the office building, half expecting to see the figure watching her from a window. But the windows were dark, and the building was silent. Emma never returned to work after that night. She couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been in that building wasn't done with her. The company tried to reach out, but she refused to answer their calls or emails. And every night, as she lay in bed, she could still hear that tapping sound, growing louder, closer, waiting for her to return.